And I appreciate having the time to listen while I'm doing something else, and I can learn from that. And by listening to Ancient Faith, it keeps you connected during the day, during the week. It has impacted my personal life, my spiritual life, and my professional life. I've learned a lot through Ancient Faith. It has affected greatly my relationships, especially in my marriage and in the parenting of my children. I am more intentional about how I respond to others. I'm trying to see Christ in everybody. I'm working on that. I understand so much more about my faith.
This tool of Ancient Faith Radio is an exceptional opportunity for the church to support and to help to build this ministry that helps connect people on the internet to real places, real Orthodox parishes where they can find ministry, where they can find hope, where they can find help, and where they might be able to become Orthodox.
I don't know of another ministry that's had a more significant reach and greater impact than Ancient Faith Ministries. I hear from people really all over the world who have listened to the podcasts, who have read the books, who have seen their lives and their faith transformed by the content. If you haven't listened to it before or read one of the books, I'd encourage you to do so.
My faith informs my practice as a family physician, and through Ancient Faith, I feel like I'm able to see my patients in a more holistic sense. I was having a conversation with a patient about a particular struggle she was having, and I found myself echoing some of these concepts that I had learned in the podcast. It was just like it was flowing through me. And when we were done, she paused and she looked at me and she said, "Thank you, that was very helpful." And I felt like it was a moment of grace and true healing and strengthening for both of us. And that's very powerful.
Church in Milwaukee, the area where we now live. Since then, our family has grown by 2 more members, so my husband and I are now surprised and humbled to find ourselves raising cradle Orthodox, as well as teaching Sunday school in our parish. I've come to rely on many of the podcasts from Ancient Faith Talk Radio in my daily life, especially those from Father Stephen Freeman, Elisa Bielitich, and Nicole Rokas. And as the seed of my book grew, I had the honor of meeting many of the people whose voices are so familiar. With the publication of my book, these wonderful people are now becoming colleagues. Thank you so much, Ancient Faith, for helping my faith and my family to grow. As the organization grows too, it's my prayer that we all be transformed more and more into the fullness of what we are meant to be.
Bringing fresh air to a polluted world. This is Ancient Faith Radio.
Search the scriptures as Christ our God said in the gospel.
This is Search the Scriptures Live with Dr. Jeannie Constantinou. Join us for an interactive verse-by-verse study of the Bible with one of Orthodoxy's most respected biblical scholars. Study along with us and share your comments and questions by calling 855-237-2346. That's 855-237-2346. Here now is Dr. Jeannie Constantinou.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Illumine our hearts, O Master who loves mankind, with the pure light of thy divine knowledge, and open the eyes of our minds to understand thy gospel teachings. Implant in us also the fear of thy blessed commandments, that trampling down all carnal desires, we may enter upon a spiritual manner of living, both thinking and doing such things that are well-pleasing to thee. For thou art the illumination of our souls and bodies, O Christ our God. And to thee we ascribe glory, together with thy Father who is from everlasting, and thine all holy and good and life-giving Spirit, now and ever, and unto the ages of ages. Amen. Christos anesti, Christ is risen. Hello, brothers and sisters. It's so nice to be with you again this evening. Today is May 18th, 2020, and you're listening to Search the Scriptures Live. I'm Dr. Jeannie Constantinou, and I realized lately I've forgotten to give the phone number like I used to, and I'm supposed to give you the phone number in case you want to call in with any comments or questions. And if you would like to do that, to participate live in our program tonight, you can call 855-237-2346 or 855-AF-radio. And you can also submit questions to ask@ancientfaith.com or in the chat room, or by writing to us at searchthescriptures@ancientfaith.com. So tonight we're going to continue our discussion about women and women in the church. And I'm going to begin by reviewing what we said last week. Father Kosta never approves of this. And by the way, he wanted to join us tonight, and he might show up because he wasn't feeling that great earlier this afternoon. So he didn't think he could do it. But he's gave me his notes to read because he wants to give us his opinion. You're not surprised, right? So that's his opinion. But we'll see if we read his notes, or hopefully he'll come and give us his own opinion in his own voice. But I would like to review what we said last time a bit more succinctly, because there was a lot of reading, there was a lot of Chrysostom, and so I just want to encapsulate everything for you, recapitulate everything for you, because this also helps us to learn. You know how often Chrysostom repeated the same things over and over, and the congregation complained, of course. And he said, well, I keep repeating it, but you haven't learned anything. So what I really would like, I hope, is that you yourselves would be able to talk about these things, to explain it effectively, to explain exactly what Chrysostom said, to explain what the scriptures mean on this issue. So you don't just say, well, I heard Dr. Jeannie say this thing once upon a time. You know, I don't want you to refer to me. I'd like you to refer to the interpretation by St. John Chrysostom and the meaning of the Greek words. That would be much more effective than telling people that you heard this on a program. So after we review what we talked about last week, which I hope to do relatively quickly, we will discuss some other issues which do come up concerning women in the church, namely the question of the effect of the sin of Eve, and why Paul said there's neither male nor female in the church, when at the same time we see these kinds of gender distinctions. And also because it came up, one person did write to me about why women don't enter the sanctuary of an Orthodox church. And I said, boy, that's really kind of getting off topic. But I decided to discuss it because it's just part of, the whole question. It's part of the issue. So we're going to talk about this whole idea of uncleanliness and why women don't go in the altar area. What's up with that? And anyhow, let's go ahead and get started. So we're going to begin with 1 Timothy chapter 2. At the beginning of the chapter, because we have to pay attention to the context. Remember, in biblical interpretation, it's all about context. We do not interpret a verse by itself, taken out of its context. That's how we end up with heresy. That's how we end up with distortions. So let's look at this chapter. The beginning of the chapter, Paul says, I urge that supplications, prayers, intercessions, and thanksgivings be made to all men, for kings, etc. First of all, notice that we do that in the Divine Liturgy. We always pray for our president or queen, the prime minister, whoever is the head of state in your country. That is something that we do. And look, it's a biblical thing. But notice that he's talking about prayers, supplications, intercessions, and thanksgivings. And then he says This is acceptable in the sight of God our Savior, who desires all men to be saved and come to knowledge of the truth. That's a very important verse in Orthodox theology, directly contradicts predestination, which we already spoke about last time. And then says, for there is one God and one mediator between God and man, the man Christ Jesus. And I pointed out to you that this is what most people point to disagree with the practice of prayers to saints, right? A lot of Protestants will cite this verse. There's one mediator. You can't mediate. But look at the context, dear people. How does he begin? Okay, that verse is verse 5. But verse 1 says to give supplications, prayers, intercessions, and thanksgivings. So he's telling us to intercede for other people. That's what it is, to make supplication and prayers for the kings and for other rulers. So obviously that is an intercession. So when we're talking about prayers to saints, it's intercessory prayer. We're not praying to the saints because we worship them. So what does he mean then by there is just one mediator? One person who mediates salvation. Because Jesus is not our mediator to the Father. He doesn't pray for us. Jesus doesn't pray for us to the Father. Jesus mediates salvation. He reveals the Father. He died on the cross. He's the only one through whom we achieve salvation. That's what it means. It's not saying that, again, you notice that if you simply take that verse out of the context, you can make the argument, oh, you can't have any intercession. There's no such thing. But the whole section begins with this instruction by St. Paul that we should pray for each other. We should make intercessions and prayers and supplications for other people. And so there's nothing wrong with the saints also doing that, because that is what they're doing. So again, notice how important the context is. So it is after this that he continues in verse 8 to talk about worship. That's the context for our whole discussion about women being silent in the churches, okay? That's the context. That's why I'm going over this with you again. So in verse 8, he says, I desire, therefore, that in every place the men should pray, lifting holy hands without arguing or quarreling. The women should not adorn themselves with gold and braided hair. So women shouldn't try to look fancy or anything, but just present themselves as properly, as what is proper for women who are pious and reverent. Okay? Then we have the famous verse 11, let a woman learn in silence with all submissiveness, followed by verse 12, I permit no woman to teach or have authority over men. She is to keep, this is the RSV translation, she is to keep silent. For Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. Yet woman will be saved through bearing children if she continues in faith, love, holiness, with modesty, etc. And it's interesting, it says modesty, it's sophrosinis, which is like prudence. Really not modesty, it's prudence. Okay, so the context of the statements about women, and we've got 3 of them here, are all in this context of worship service. The 3 issues were whether or not women are saved by childbearing, or what does this mean? And then the woman being silent, and then his statement that a woman cannot teach or have authority over men. So last time, what does that mean? We talked about what it means that a woman will be saved by childbearing. He doesn't mean simply by having children. That doesn't really give you any, for virtue or anything like that. Simply anybody can have children. Almost anybody can make a child. That doesn't mean that simply having children is salvific. Okay, if that were enough, just think about it. Why would Christ need to be incarnate? Why would the Son be incarnate if just by having children? That can't be right. Okay, so we know it's not enough simply to have children, because also look at the context. He says, if she continues in faith, love, holiness, and prudence. So it is the virtues that we acquire, hopefully, when we raise our children, that help toward our salvation, because we do learn a lot as parents, and it requires a lot of growth, a lot of self-sacrifice. And Chrysostom said this, that this is how a woman achieves salvation as a mother. Obviously, not by simply having children, but by growing in virtue. And this is something which is also open to single women, to nuns and others, and also to men. And Chrysostom specifically mentions men. Their role as fathers also helps them achieve salvation if they do it in a Christian manner. You see, and also the fact that by raising Christian children, this is a great gift to the world, and that this is something through which we can acquire virtue. But simply making babies doesn't save you. Okay, so don't take it that way. That is not what he's saying. And that interpretation, of course, comes from St. John Chrysostom. That was pretty easy. Okay, here was a more difficult one. Let a woman learn in silence. Okay, and here the statement seems very clear. So if it's so clear and so direct, why does it need interpretation? Why are we talking about it? Because it seems to conflict with other passages in St. Paul and the ministry of Paul himself, not to mention the role of women in the early church and the way the Lord himself treated women. So when we see this kind of conflict, we have to ask, what does this mean? And we have to really examine the statement, not just take it on its face value, which is easy to do, especially for men. Well, let a woman be silent. Okay, you have to be quiet. Sit in the corner and be quiet, because St. Paul said women have to be silent. So that's why I was talking previously about that statement that directly contradicted predestination, that it is the will of God that all people be saved and come to knowledge of the truth. So when we have a statement like St. Paul saying we have been predestined by God, then we have to look at that. Well, how do we interpret that in light of other passages in the Bible? So we have to look at the totality of the comments to know, was Paul really saying that some people will be saved and others will be damned based on nothing that they do? It's just the whim of God. It's totally up to him, and he's going to decide in a very arbitrary manner, you're saved, you're in, you're out. So we don't make a theology based on a verse taken out of context. We have to understand the context in which a statement is made, and then also interpret it in light of other statements that are made by that same biblical author, preferably, but also by the whole Bible. So that's why there's a question about the statement, let a woman learn in silence, because that doesn't seem to reflect the life of Paul. So this is the reason why some people have said Paul never wrote this. And even their statements about women being silent in 1 Corinthians, which Paul also says that in 1 Corinthians. People have said Paul never wrote this, but there's no evidence that Paul didn't write it. You see, this is one of the reasons why people say that Paul didn't write this whole letter of 1 Timothy. They say Paul's not the author because this doesn't reflect what Paul said about what Paul thought about women. So for that, but what about 1 Corinthians? He says the same thing, but people don't challenge Paul's authorship of 1 Corinthians. But then what do? They say, well, someone added that later. You see, these evil, wicked men wanted to, keep women submissive. So somebody just added that into the manuscripts. But there is no manuscript that doesn't have it. You see, you can't make that case based on the manuscript. And we don't have to, because we can interpret it in the Orthodox way. And that is by looking at the context and the purpose of the statement. This is basic, okay? And this is what Chrysostom did. Chrysostom's conclusions are based entirely upon the context and the literary analysis of the words and the skopos, the purpose why Paul made these statements. Okay, and nobody can say that Chrysostom is a feminist, that's for sure. He usually gets accused of the other thing. So let's start with the historical context. Were women expected to be silent in the early church, never talk? Well, we can start with Christ. Of course, we have female disciples, we have female apostles, not to mention Mary Magdalene, she's the most famous one. Fortini, who we remembered yesterday because yesterday was the Sunday of the Samaritan woman. That was Saint Fortini. Yesterday was also the feast day of Andronicus and Junia, a married couple who are called apostles by St. Paul, and he mentions them in chapter 16 of the book of Romans. Okay, that's a woman, and she is an apostle, not is apostolos, but apostolos. So later, the term apostle was limited just to the 12, but in the early church, there were hundreds of people who were called apostle, those who were part of the ministry of Christ while he was alive on this earth, who were eyewitnesses to the resurrection and went out preaching. All of those people were called apostles, and that included many women, including Joanna, Susanna, Mary, the wife of Cleopas, Mary and Martha. So these women were apostles, preachers, teachers, evangelists. We have the 4 daughters of Philip who are prophets mentioned in the book of Acts. Of course, there's co-workers of Paul, Priscilla, Claudia, who we're going to mention, we'll talk about later today. She's mentioned in, anyhow, we'll talk about her. And Phoebe, the deacon. So were women expected to be silent all the time? So in this case, in 1 Timothy, it says, let the women learn in silence, not be silent, but learn in silence, because if you're talking, you're not learning. And after this, I know that some people are listening in the chat room. I still don't understand the purpose of the chat room, but I guess people like it. So those of you who are in the chat room who are chatting and talking to each other while the program is going on, you're not listening. It's like talking in class. So this is why he's saying it. They should learn silently, because when they were in church, they were talking during the divine services. They were having conversations. So this is how we know. We know because of other statements made by St. Paul and the literary context. So the other statement is in 1 Corinthians chapter 14, in which the whole chapter is also about order and reverence. And he starts out by saying, each one of you is going to give a hymn or a lesson or a revelation or a tongue or interpretation when you come together. That's synaxis. That's when you gather as a group for prayer. Let each one of you, but let it be done in orderly. Let it be done in an edifying manner. We can't have everybody talking at once. So apparently the Corinthians were kind of disorganized. Everybody was talking at once. And he says, when one person is speaking, let the others be silent. That's everybody, including the men. Everybody's supposed to be silent when someone else is speaking in church. So when I'm reading the epistle in church, if I hear somebody starting to talk, or if everybody isn't really settled at the beginning of the epistle reading or the prophecy or whatever I'm reading in church, I wait until everybody's quiet. That's appropriate. And that is what Paul is asking for. And he concludes that chapter, this is 1 Corinthians, by saying that God is not a God of confusion, but of peace. And then he says women have to keep silent in the churches. All right? And everything should be done decently and in order. Why does he say silent? When earlier he said, in the same chapter, he said, each one of you is going to offer an interpretation or tongue or prophecy or whatever. And earlier in chapter 11, he says, when a woman prophesies or prays in church, she should cover her head. Is he contradicting himself? Is St. Paul kind of schizophrenic? Did he forget what he said? No, he means it in the most basic way. And the word is to talk. And that means have a conversation. And this is exactly the purpose of the passage in both 1 Timothy and 1 Corinthians, when it talks about women being silent, that they must be reverent and quiet in church, because we usually like to talk. We talk too much. That's just the way it is. Okay. So this is the literary context. Also, So we have a historical context that women were active in the ministry of the early church. We have the literary context, which is worship services. Don't talk during the services. And when we looked at St. John Chrysostom and his sermons on 1 Corinthians 11, 1 Corinthians 14, Romans 16, he said repeatedly in all of those cases that when St. Paul said women should be silent, it was to cut off conversation. And then he went off on a tangent about how he's preaching and people are talking while he's preaching. Then they're complaining because they can't hear. So this was a problem. And, it's kind of unusual, I suppose. I think today more people, are more reverent, especially in more developed countries like, America. But in other places, there's a lot of talking that goes on, sometimes in church. So sometimes in the developed world, America and Canada, we have our pews and we're kind of, sitting in our little pews. But in the early church, people were standing. And as we still do in many Orthodox churches where there really aren't a lot of chairs and people are standing, sometimes they're moving about and they're lighting candles or they're kissing the icons or something like this. So there was a bit of movement. And sometimes people would just start little conversations on the side. Or a woman might say to her husband, what did he say? What did he say? Or what did he mean by that? And she's expecting him to answer her. And this is why St. Paul says, let her ask her husband at home what was meant by the reading or the sermon or whatever. Okay? So now Chrysostom has a reputation for being a misogynist. A lot of people have read what he said, some of his statements about women in his sermons, and they conclude that he's a misogynist, one who hates women. And nothing could be further from the truth. He loved everybody, and he had a very dear friend. One of his closest friends was a woman, the deaconess Olympias, and he had many other close female friends, and he was raised by a wonderful single mother, Anthusa. So why do we have this? Why do people have this idea of Chrysostom? Because sometimes in his sermons, he's very critical of women for being frivolous or vain or whatever. But you have to read a lot of criticism of Chrysostom to see that he criticizes everybody. And if a woman is deserving of praise, he praises her. If she's deserving of criticism, he criticizes her. Likewise with the men. He's very critical of men, but nobody says he's a misanthrope, that he hates men. Why do they say that about him and women? Now, Chrysostom, to a certain extent, had 4th century ideas about women. And when I read those, I sometimes laugh. I think I chuckled a little bit last week. He says they're kind of flighty, or they're sort of weak in the mind, or they're a little bit not quite as intelligent as men, or they're very emotional, these kinds of things. That's because he's a man of the 4th century. You can't expect him to think like a modern person. But he didn't think that they were unequal. He certainly didn't say they have to be quiet and exercise no leadership in the church. He never said that. So he's contradicting what a lot of people are saying, and he is from the 4th century. So he's really honestly interpreting the scriptures according to what he knows about the life of Paul, about the ministry of women in the early church in his own time. Do you know that St. John Chrysostom describes the great entrance of in the Divine Liturgy of the Church of Constantinople? And he says how many bishops would come in during the divine, the great entrance, the big entrance with the bread and the wine. He describes how many people were participating in this, and he mentions that every Sunday they had 50 deaconesses. 50. That's a lot. There were more presbyters, and there were lots of bishops too, and acolytes and whatever. This is a big liturgy. Okay, so he's very familiar with the activities of women in ministry in the church. And he was certainly not opposed to that. So he's giving us, but more than that, he's giving us an honest interpretation based on the historical context and the literary context of these verses. And he comes to this conclusion. So don't just read a few words of Chrysostom where he might talk about some women or criticize them for being vain or frivolous or having braided hair or fancy clothes, because people did. he talks about the opulence of the lifestyle of many of the people in Antioch and in Constantinople. And he talked about how some of the women, they didn't want to cross the street. They were so dainty and so spoiled, they wouldn't even cross the street to get to the other side. These are rich women. So they had their servants carry them across the street, okay? So these are the kinds of things that he's criticizing. He's not criticizing all women, just women who behave like that, and women who have gold sandals, gold embroidered sandals, or people who had literally would make gold bridles and gold bits for their horses. Okay. And so it was a disgusting show of opulence, of wealth, when people were starving in the streets. So he criticizes this, but he criticizes everybody because he's a pastor. He's trying to save their souls. So he doesn't have a thing against women or anything like this. But if you just read a couple of things of Chrysostom, then you might reach that opinion. But you have to be careful. So don't just say, the fathers say, women have to be silent. The fathers say, listen, read lavishly. Read lavishly in the fathers, and then tell me what they say. If you're going to talk about Chrysostom, what he says about women, you better be able to back that up. So he complains a lot about women and men talking in church, but women have a bigger problem with that. That's just the truth. That's who we are. That's how we are. We like to talk too much. So we have reached a half hour. Now we're going to review, when we come back from our little break, what he said. This is the harder question, when St. Paul said, I do not permit a woman to teach or have authority over men. We should add the word absolute authority over men. So here again, we have the same problem. Who wrote this? Did Paul really write this? Yes, Paul wrote this. Well, then how can Paul have female co-workers who were clearly preaching and teaching? So how did Chrysostom explain this verse? And we talked about it last week. I'll give you a quick recap after the break, and then we're going to move on to other issues regarding women in the church. But I would like you to be able to explain these things well. You should be able, don't just tell people, listen to Dr. Jeannie. You should be able to explain these things well. Make your case as a woman especially, but also as a man. So how many men are listening to this program? And you have wives, you have daughters, you have sisters. They deserve the same kind of respect that a man does. They're not supposed to be silenced on the basis that women are always supposed to be silent. So I know you care about them, so you need to be able to explain this, all right? So we're going to come back after a brief break. Join me after the break.
But the lines are open for your calls. The number is 855-237-2346. That's 855-AF Radio.
Saint Ignatius, 1st century Bishop of Antioch, called the God-bearer, is one of the earliest witnesses to the truth of Christ and the nature of the Christian life. Tradition tells us that as a small child, Ignatius was singled out by Jesus himself as an example of the childlike faith all Christians must possess. In Bearing God, Father Andrew Damick recounts the life of this great pastor, martyr, and saint, and interprets for the modern reader 5 major themes in the pastoral letters he wrote: martyrdom, salvation in Christ, the bishop, the unity of the church, and the Eucharist.
For Ignatius, martyrdom is really the fullness of Christian life, in a sense, which that can be challenging for us because, number one, he doesn't seem to have any reticence at all about going to martyrdom. Like, there's no sense of, well, this is what I have to do. You know, I wish I didn't have to, but this is God's will for me. He is going to it joyfully, gladly.
To find this book and others like it, you can go to store.ancientfaith.com. Again, that is store.ancientfaith.com.
We're back with Search the Scriptures Live with Dr. Jeannie Constantinou. Have a question about the verses we are studying tonight? Give her a call, 855-237-2346. Here once again is Dr. Jeannie.
Okay, so the third question then was, what did Paul mean when he said, I do not allow a woman to teach and have absolute authority over men? Notice that the word absolute is omitted because, and that's really not a good translation. It should say absolute authority. That would make a big difference. Okay, but when it just says in English authority over men, then again, he seems to be sort of contradicting himself. And all right, so let's take a look at this. What does Paul mean by this? How are we going to decide? And he responds by citing Chrysostom, the literary context and the historical context. The historical context is that we know that women were co-workers of Paul, that women were also carrying on conversations in the church. And so this is something that Chrysostom comments about. The literary context is that these instructions are about the worship service, not about women in general, not teaching or speaking. So that's the literary context. And the fact that immediately after this verse that says that women are not supposed to have to teach or have absolute authority over a man, St. Paul begins discussing the office of the bishop. And then Chrysostom looks at the precise meaning of the word itself. All right, so I want to, and then we're going to talk about this word, but I've got Father Kosta here who decided to join us. So Father Kosta, come over here and share my microphone. I did not think that Father Kosta was going to be able to join us. And so he's here. He wants to have a say, but you have to come here and speak into the microphone. I didn't pull out the other microphone because it is really big. It's taller than I am. So you're going to have to speak into the microphone, Father, and say your piece, okay, about what you want to say about women teachers in the church.
First of all, Christos Anesti.
Alithos Anesti.
And that's what we say, but Jesus said another word. Chérete.
Rejoice.
Rejoice. And we should also say that as well. But
to whom did he say rejoice?
To the mirror bearers.
That's right. To the women, he said rejoice. And to the men, he said shalom, peace be with you. But you have to speak up because you're far away from the microphone. Go ahead.
Well, this is from your humble servant, Father Kostas, who pushed you and urged you to become a theologian. You know that.
Yes, that is true.
And paid hundreds of thousands of dollars for your education to Holy Cross, Harvard, because you being an attorney first,
yes,
I couldn't win a single argument. Now at least we can talk a little bit.
Okay, well, it wasn't hundreds of thousands, but you did spend money on my education. But I don't think it was hundreds of thousands. If I may be a little bit picky here, that's the attorney in me.
Wasn't it $35,000 every year in Harvard? Or
no.
Anyway, just the fact that I kept you alive and educate
yes, that's
yourself.
Fine. Yes, go ahead.
And our son, come on, Jeannie.
Yes, go ahead, dear. Go ahead.
Anyway, I believe that what St. Paul says, he means it literally, and I believe that that's his opinion, even though Luther is saying that that was the commandment of Jesus, which I don't see in the scriptures. Anyway, I believe that that was a personal opinion of St. Paul, for women not to teach men, especially in church, and keep silent and what have you. I believe it was a personal opinion of St. Paul, a celibate man, that is an unmarried man who never had the experience of marriage like we poor husbands. It was also an opinion of his times, when pagan priestesses were actually prostitutes, especially, and we hear this in the Church of Corinth and Ephesus. Now, based on this, and the fact that women in many countries were not allowed to be educated much, even our lifetime, we can understand Paul's point perfectly. But today, dear brothers and sisters, it's a different story. women hold most of the teaching positions in America, in schools, in high schools, and most of the developed world. So let's compromise and make some new rules that are fair. Let's not forget that the first teachers of boys and girls are their mothers at home. And according to modern psychology, our characters are formed in the first months and years of our lives. So I will present something, and I want to hear my wife explaining that or telling us what she thinks. Do you agree that only pious, Orthodox theologians, men and women, can preach in the church or lead a Bible class with the permission of the local bishop or priest? I want to say your husband, but I'll leave that out.
Do I agree with that? That's what the church has.
After all, they teach us husbands many lessons without anybody's permission,
That's true.
whether we like it or not.
That's true.
And there is a verb there, aphthendin, in Greek, which talks about, being
absolute authority,
authoritarian, whatever.
Right.
Something like
We're not allowed
this.
to be authoritarian.
Neither men, especially today. But can we at least agree on this much? Priesthood is another subject.
That's a different subject.
Let us discuss it another time.
That's a different subject. That's not.
Now, can you allow me to say a couple of other things?
Okay, dear, go ahead.
Saint Phocius,
yes,
10th century, and Saint Nicodemus of Mount Athos also agree that women are saved if married and mothers through giving birth. One thing we don't usually mention is that, they're teaching their children their first lessons when the character of a human being is formed.
Sweetheart, but that's what St. Paul said.
Yeah, but
so they're not adding anything to it. They're not explaining it.
Luther, in the 16th century, 400 or 500 years ago, he said women can only give birth or become prostitutes. I gave you the exact code last time. I don't have it right now,
I don't have
but
it.
I found it on the internet.
Oh.
Now, in a sermon on Joel chapter 2, verse 28, he says the 4 daughters of Philip were prophets. A woman can do this, not preach in public, but console and teach. A woman can do this just as much as a man, become a prophet. Okay. Now, John Calvin is such a commentator and argues that the verses that say women must be silent are clear and literal, while the verses in 1 Corinthians 11 about women praying or prophesying, as long as their heads are covered, do not really mean what they seem to be saying.
Okay, but Father, you've got a little problem here, okay? Because you started out by saying that, in your opinion, you think that that's what Paul was really saying. Women shouldn't teach and they should be silent. Then you're disagreeing with Chrysostom.
I'm talking about Luther and Calvin.
I know, but you started out by saying you thought that because he was an unmarried man, that this is what...
Can I express my opinions without
Yeah, but you said that
interfering?
first. You said that first. You don't disagree then. You don't disagree with Chrysostom.
Jenny, my point is this.
Yes, what is your point?
Both St. Paul
yes.
and St. John Chrysostom
yes.
and some of these other people, they were celibate.
Okay.
They were not married. They don't have the experience of marriage. Are you going to tell me that I haven't learned anything by being married to you and suffering all these years, 40 years?
Okay.
Come on.
Okay.
And I'm sure you were suffering too.
Of course, we learn a lot. There's no question. There's no question that the married life does teach us a lot about the complementary gifts of spouses, okay? But he's not talking about that.
May I bring another example?
Yes, but I'm giving you 2 minutes.
It was my disagreement with the famous Bishop Callistus Ware.
What?
He came to Holy Cross Seminary, and his theme was, family, the Holy Trinity, and all that. And I said to him, I'm sorry, Your Grace, do you think you're really the expert to talk about the family? Someone who rejected the family, who did not get married?
He didn't get married, but...
Yeah, but the thing is, come on,
but
he's not an expert in the family.
Well, definitely married priests have a lot to say about that, and I think they have a lot to offer. But but Chrysostom also has the best statements about married life of all the fathers of the church.
He was lucky. He wasn't married.
No, but he had a wonderful mom, I think. And of course, they also observed married life. Anyhow, sweetheart, thank you very much for your comments. You want to hang around while we finish the discussion?
A little bit.
Okay, very good.
I want to make sure you do not misinterpret my opinions.
Okay, I'm not going to misinterpret your opinions. Okay, so we were talking about how Chrysostom resolved the question of the statement, I do not permit a woman to teach or have absolute authority over men. And it was in his homily 31 on Romans, where he's talking about the women that Paul mentions in chapter 16 of Romans, that he talks about how they are not permitted to have authority, absolute authority over men. That is the difference. So it's not that they cannot teach, it's not that they cannot preach, but that they cannot have absolute authority. And the word there, and Father mentioned it in his comments, is authentia. And so, unfortunately, I'm looking for my copy here. There we go. In the RSV and other translations, you see, in English, we don't have a word that denotes absolute authority, unless you said, what was the word that you just used? Sort of, but it had a negative sense. What did you say? The women to be sort of domineering or something like this. That's a negative sense. But here, in order to convey that sense of the word authentia, which is not the usual word used for authority, we have to add the adjective absolute authority. But that's not how it's translated. So it's translated as though in the regular sense. So here is what Chrysostom said, okay, about Mary, whom this is not, we don't know which Mary this is. It was a very common name. So this is in Romans chapter 16, when St. Paul says, greet Mary, who bestowed much labor on us. And Chrysostom talks about how many women carried on the race the apostles and evangelists ran. In what sense, then, does he say, I do not allow a woman to teach? He means to hinder her from publicly coming forward from the seat of the vima and not from the word of teaching. Since if this were the case, how would he have said to the woman who has an unbelieving husband, how do you know if you might not save your husband? How was it that Priscilla even instructed Apollos? So he makes it very clear that this means that women are not permitted to become bishops or presbyters. And that word, the designation of bishop and presbyter, was used interchangeably. They didn't have what we would call today 3 levels of clergy. Today we'll say, well, we have 3 levels of higher clergy. There's a deacon, a presbyter, or a priest, and the bishop. But in the early church at the time of Paul, the term elder, presbyteros, and episkopos, bishop, were used interchangeably. And we see this in the New Testament. We see this in the epistle of Titus, where he's talking, and you'll also notice this in 1 Timothy, when he gives instructions about how to choose a bishop, then he skips straight to deacon, because the term elder, presbyter, and episkopos, bishop, were used interchangeably. It isn't until the end of the 1st century when those get divided. And by the time of St. Ignatius, who was mentioned in the break during the commercial break, we see St. Ignatius, it has an authority above other presbyters. So that happened later. This is not the case in the time of St. Paul. So since we mentioned Andronicus and Junia, whose feast day was yesterday, this is what Chrysostom said about them. This is a married couple who were St. Paul's relatives and fellow prisoners with Paul, who are of note among the apostles. And indeed, to be apostles is a great thing. But to be even among these of note, consider what great encomium this is. How great is the devotion of this woman, that's Junia, that she should even be counted worthy of the appellation apostle. Now, what's really interesting here is that Chrysostom recognizes that Junia is an apostle. And many interpreters after the time of Chrysostom didn't recognize that she was an apostle or that she was a woman. They thought she was a man because they said, oh, only men can be apostles. And in many translations of the Bible, they add an S to Junia's name and call her Junius. But that would make her a man, okay? But there's no such thing as a man's name, Junius, only a woman, Junia. So the word there, when he says, I do not permit a woman to teach and have absolute authority over a man, is the word authentia or authenteo. And as we mentioned, that is the word that's used for a bishop, for God, for the abbot or abbess of a monastery, for kings, people who exercise absolute authority. So women have never had that role in the church. They've never had absolute authority in the church. And yet we have some authority. We have a teaching authority. I have authority over men, even over my husband at times. Do I have authority over you?
Shame on you. May I say a word?
Okay, let me finish this point. Okay, so I have had a lot of priests as my students. Priests at Holy Cross, Greek Orthodox priests. I've had Coptic priests, Catholic priests, because sometimes men from other countries come here to be educated. They were already ordained in their church, but they were not educated yet. So I've had Catholic priests, Episcopal priests, Orthodox priests, and others. So I've had authority over them as a teacher in the classroom, but as a member of the church, I don't have authority over them, and neither does any lay man. So it's not because I'm a woman, but because I'm not a bishop, and I will never be a bishop or a presbyter. And this is Chrysostom's conclusion. So it's not that women have to just be silent in general. And if somebody says this, then let them take it up with Chrysostom, because he says, and sometimes people say, well, they can't teach publicly. He doesn't say, Chrysostom doesn't say they can't teach publicly, but they can teach privately. He doesn't say that. He says they cannot teach from the vima. That is the royal gate. That is the altar area. That is the role. They cannot usurp the role of the presbyter or the bishop. This is not a general statement about men and women or husbands and wives. Father, go ahead. What do you want to say?
You just said you don't want to be a bishop. Why are you behaving like a bishop in your own home?
I'm not.
I mean, I'm afraid of you more than my own bishop.
Good. That's good.
Now, I want to say something about Saint Fotini, the Samaritan woman that we talked about yesterday.
Yes.
Now, she was called equal to the apostles. Actually, from the 4th century to the 14th century, I mean, including the Dark Ages, she was referred to as equal to the apostles. And actually, she was given the place of honor, that she was higher than the apostles. And if you know her story, the fact that she went even to Carthage and Rome, and so the emperor there, her 5 sisters became Orthodox, a couple of children that she had, one of the most pious families that became saints. She was referred to as equal to the apostles and even above them.
But that term is given by the church later, because later the term apostle came to be limited to the 12. But in the early church, she was an apostle because she knew the Lord. She had actually was part of the ministry of Christ.
The other point I want to make, if you permit me, a couple of minutes, is the fact that I don't know why you talk about silence if it's a vice.
It's not a vice.
It's a virtue.
Okay.
I mean, I remember when I would go to the monasteries and convents, and the monks or the nuns would not talk to us.
Mm-hmm.
And we thought maybe they didn't like us or they didn't want to serve us or whatever, and that wasn't true. it's a virtue to
what
keep
Father's
silence.
trying to say, that's what Father's trying to say. And that's true. And you know what? We don't mind that. And I know that that's something a lot of us women need to work on. But it's different to say that we should work on being silent and being humble, which is something that all Christians should work on, and trying to keep women down and in sort of in their place, as some men think. Okay? Right? That's not
Why
what
do
you're
you have
saying.
to interrupt me? I want to finish my
because
thoughts.
I only have 35 minutes left.
You know,
sweetheart.
the goddess, even in ancient Greece,
Yeah, I got to be more.
of silence was Calypso.
Calypso. Don't get into that. Make your comment, because I'm going to run out of time here with this program.
Yeah, but it's a great virtue.
Okay,
and I
agreed.
I think it honors
Issachia.
you to be silent. I mean, don't pretend like, women should just talk. And this is the time we reach the point where, women like to talk and gossip and what have you.
Gossip is wrong. Talk is wrong. But we're talking about teaching. Okay, that's what so don't take it out of context.
My
Here we're talking
problem
about
is
context.
the word afthendin in Greek.
Yes.
You're
Absolute
trying to
authority.
pretend like you're superior than man.
No.
Okay, and that's the point the fathers make about Eve being tempted.
Okay, that's a whole
by the
different. That's a
devil.
whole different subject. Which, if you let me finish, we might get to today. Okay. No, we're not talking about being. Definitely, women can never in the church have that position of absolute authority, because we will never be presbyters and bishops. But still, we have authority over others, and yet we have authority. I have somebody who's an authority over me. Who is it? Who's an authority over me?
Your father?
Come on, stop it. You are. Okay.
When I demand dinner?
I don't. Speaking of which, you should go check on dinner. No, my father doesn't have authority over me anymore. But the only man I recognize as having authority over me is you and my spiritual father. But the spiritual father has authority over all his spiritual children, whether they're men or women. Okay, so the only man. So the statements about having authority over a woman is not that all men have authority over all women. It's that in a marriage situation, the man is the head. Okay, that's the only thing. So the only head of me is you. Okay, that's it. I don't recognize anybody else.
Name.
Okay, stop.
In actual thing, women are they're running their homes.
That's right. That's right. That's why I said. But that's why I said that really men had to have the headship, because women are so dominant in the home. Anyhow, are you done? Because I would like to move on, because I do have an email question.
First of all, what are we talking about? What is this letter of St. Paul?
Father, please. It's First Timothy
and Second Timothy, right?
Yeah. What about it?
I don't think you mentioned it.
Yes, I guess we did.
What are we talking about?
Okay, we're not talking about the whole letter. We're just talking about some important passages from these letters. So here's the email which I received last week, and that's a good thing you're here, Father Kosta. So here's a statement in the email. I was told, this is from a woman, that Bible study groups for women need a priest/male present. Is this true? Can women simply teach other women? Thanks. And she signed her name. So I have to tell you, I was very disheartened to receive this email that day after last week's lesson. I thought, did anybody hear what I said last week? And I reached out to this listener, and I emailed her back, and I asked her who told her this, and what did they say? Did they say that a priest has to be present for a woman's Bible study, or a male? Because there's a big difference. And who told her this? Was this her priest? And unfortunately, she didn't answer me. So here is my response, and I'm glad Father is here, because I want to talk about this. So hold on one second, Father. So and this is the answer to the email, if your priest said that he must be present for a Bible study, whether it's a woman's Bible study or any other one, there may be a very valid reason for that. And it may not have anything to do with the gender of the people in the Bible study. The priest has to be confident that whoever is leading that Bible study has an orthodox theological education, because a Bible study is not a free-for-all. It's not for us to get together and just say, well, what do you think it means? What do you think it means? It can't be the blind leading the blind. The priest is responsible for the spiritual direction of the parish, and he's responsible to the bishop, and of course he's answerable to God. So if there's a chance, obviously, if it's a priest who said this, and if he said that he needs to be present, there's a reason for that, okay? And it's not because women can't teach women, but because he has to be confident of the content of what people are being taught. Now, if he said that a man, any man, has to be present, I find that really hard to believe. I find that, I mean, unless it's some other sect. But in the Orthodox Church, I've never heard anybody say that a women's Bible study can't meet because a man has to be there, whether he's a priest or not. So we've had a lot of experience. Father Kosta's had a lot of experience with people running Bible studies who were literally Protestants, who had the name Orthodox, but they were so-called born-again Christians, and then they tried to take over our Bible studies and our Sunday school. So, this is why the priest may have said this, and if this is what he meant, he's correct in this. But it's not because you're a woman. So go ahead, Father. What do you want to say about that?
If I may, I like to put this in a historical context, okay?
Just as long as you talk fast.
The Greeks were under the Turks for 400-500 years. That's what we call the Dark Ages. In a few words, when the West was going through Renaissance, we're going through our Dark Ages, which, the Turks would not allow us to have schools. So nobody could be educated. Mm-hmm. The only ones that they were a little bit educated, and I'm talking about reading Greek, were the priests. And they're the ones that would teach the Psalms and just read them and what have you. There was no interpretation, nothing. And because the Greeks did not want to change the original with any translation, they kept ignorant for many centuries. We have to admit this, that Orthodoxy despised the Bible for quite a few centuries.
To despise it, they just didn't pay attention to it because most people were uneducated.
Yeah, they were listening to it in churches.
Orthodox countries.
That's where they were listening to the Bible and what have you. But they did not really have Bible classes.
Yeah, they couldn't.
That was a Protestant thing. And, when I started having Bible classes, I realized that some of the students would really leave the Orthodox Bible class and go with the Protestants. So, some people said, a Bible class is not really an Orthodox thing to do, which is wrong. Right. But at the same time, it's, let's face it, the Protestants are doing a lot of work on Bible classes, on sermons and what have you, and they attract people, much more than we do when it comes to Bible classes.
Yeah.
So the priests for many, many centuries did not have any idea what the Bible was. And it was not only the Greeks who had the original, but even the Russians and what have you. I believe that today we miss a lot in not knowing Greek. You should hear some of the preachers in Greece right now, some of the Russians and what have you. We don't know the language.
Yes. So the point is we cannot compare the situation in the Orthodox Church today to what was happening in the West, because we are only recently coming out of hundreds of years of Muslim occupation, and it's still the case for many of the Arabic Orthodox. They're still under Muslim occupation, including our own patriarchate. And then Russia is just recently coming out of communist oppression, and also the Eastern Bloc countries. So we are really sort of behind the curve. But the church never despised the Bible. The church just didn't pay a lot of attention to the Bible because not only lay people were uneducated, so were the clergy. Many of them could not even read. So we've reached the top of the hour. We're going to take a couple of minutes break,
the word in Greek is amathia, ignorance. We have to admit that.
They couldn't read. They weren't educated. All right, so let's take a break and come back in a couple of minutes.
We are back with Search the Scriptures Live with Dr. Jeannie Constantinou. Have a question about the verses we are studying tonight? Give her a call at 855-237-2346. Here once again is Dr. Jeannie.
I guess I'm back. That was a real quick... Am I off or on? That was a real quick break. Okay, so... All right, so I wanted to read one thing because of the question which was asked, and that is about whether or not a woman can teach a man. And I wanted to share something with you because it's not just Chrysostom. I read something very beautiful by Saint Gregory the theologian, on his mother.
God bless you from me.
Okay,
Goodbye.
Father Kosta is saying, well, thank you, Father. Thanks for dropping in. Okay. Here's what St. Gregory of Nazianzus, the theologian, said about his mother. She who was given by God to my father became not only, her name was Nona, by the way, and she was also a saint, not only, as is less wonderful, his assistant, but even his teacher, drawing him on by her influence in deed and word to the highest intelligence, judging it best in all other respects to be overruled by her husband according to the law of marriage, but not being ashamed in regard to piety, even to offer herself as his teacher. Admirable indeed as was this conduct of hers, it was still more admirable that he should readily acquiesce in it. So why was Gregory the theologian's mother teaching his father? Because his father was a pagan. And then later he became a Christian and later became a bishop himself. His name was also Gregory, okay? So today we have many Orthodox theologians who are women and lay men theologians too. So the answer to the question of the role of women in the church is that women in the church can do anything that lay men can do in the church, except become a bishop or a priest. Now, what about this question about there's neither male nor female, slave nor free, Jew nor Greek? So what is it that Chrysostom said about this? And what does this mean? Why does Paul talk about this if clearly he's saying that there are gender roles? It's not that there's no such thing as gender roles. There are by nature. We have gender roles. But in the church, we are equal. And we see this to a remarkable degree because this is a tremendous difference between us and the Jews at the time and between even the pagan culture at the time. So many people accuse St. Paul of oppressing women, or even Christ of oppressing women. But Christ was a great liberator of women. And Paul was also recognizing women as co-workers of his. But this doesn't mean that we don't have sometimes other roles, especially in marriage. And Chrysostom said this about Claudia. I mentioned that in 2 Timothy, at the end of the epistle of 2 Timothy, Paul mentions Claudia. And here is what St. John Chrysostom said about Claudia. I hope I can find this. Right. All right. And Claudia, this is his homily 10 on 2 Timothy. You see how zealous for the faith the women were, how ardent. Such was Priscilla, and this Claudia, already crucified, already prepared for the battle. But why, when there were so many faithful, does he mention only these women? Manifestly because they in purpose had already withdrawn from worldly affairs and were illustrious above the others. For a woman as such meets with no impediments. It is the work of divine grace that this sex should be impeded only in the affairs of this life, or rather, not even in them. For a woman undertakes no small share of the whole administration, being keeper of the house, and without her, not even political affairs could be properly conducted. For if their domestic concerns were in a state of confusion and disorder, those who are engaged in public affairs would be kept at home, and political business would be ill managed. So that neither in those matters, as neither in spiritual, is she inferior. So that's Chrysostom. Okay, that's Chrysostom commenting on Claudia. So in terms of the church, there really is neither male nor female. The only thing that isn't open to women is the priesthood. But then most men are not priests either. Okay, so we stand at the same position as all other lay people. Okay? And the only thing that we cannot do is become priests. And the only thing that only priests and bishops can do is celebrate the holy mysteries. If you want to have a church service, you can still say the prayers of the service. You don't have to have a priest present. You can do a lot of the services by yourself. Okay? So the only thing that is necessary for priests is to do things like consecrate the bread and wine, say the blessing over the baptismal waters. Those things are exclusive to the priesthood, but if you really look at it in the whole context of ministry, that's a very small exception. So women can do everything that men can do. Now, what is this about Eve? Clearly, something happened at the fall, right? And it was funny that Chrysostom was saying, or it said that Eve was deceived. Well, Adam was deceived too. And some of the fathers mentioned the fact that at least Eve gave some kind of reply to the serpent, whereas Adam just sort of fell. His wife gave him this fruit, and he just took it without any kind of real questioning. I think even Chrysostom comments on that. Here's my consideration. This is why Paul said there is neither male nor female. That's why Christ recognized the equality of women when no rabbi did in his day. Rabbis would not even speak to their wives in public. That's how low the status of women was in Judaism. And as a matter of fact, in the Talmud, it says, in the Jerusalem Talmud, one of the rabbis said, a woman's wisdom is in the spindle. The words of the Torah should be burned rather than entrusted to a woman. And then another place in the other Talmud, there's more than one Talmud, the other Talmud, he says that anyone who teaches his daughter the Torah teaches her to be obscene. Okay, in other words, and it's a kind of a slur word for sexual obscenities, okay? So that was the attitude of many men, and still is in some, not mostly in Judaism anymore, but in some areas of Judaism today. But it was rampant in the time of Christ. So Christ, remember, praised Mary, who was sitting at his feet, not listening, not Martha, who was busy in the kitchen and complaining that her sister wasn't helping her. So Jesus elevated the status of women. So when St. Paul says there's neither male nor female, what is he talking about? Why? How can there be neither male nor female? We're all equal in the church. We're all made in the image of God. And I think it's very important that we remember what happened at the resurrection. What is the effect of the resurrection? We're in the period of the resurrection right now. We're looking at the icon every day. I look at the icon of the resurrection every day. I have it out in my house in about 3 different places. What is the effect of the resurrection? What do we see Christ doing in that incredible icon of the resurrection? He's lifting Adam and Eve out of their graves. Is it just that he's giving them life? And it's not just Adam, it's both of them, Adam and Eve. By rising from the dead, the Lord reversed the effects of the fall. This is what we mean when we say he trampled down death by death. This is why we sing in the hymns that Eve is liberated. So when Eve was cursed because of the fall, when God said that, you know, your desire will be for your husband and he will lord it over you, that is erased. So husbands are not to lord over their wives. They still have headship in the home. And there's a reason for that. I explained that already. I think there's a very good reason for that. But the point is, the husbands don't lord themselves over their wives, and men are not recognized in the church as superior to women in general, and women sort of have to stay in their place. So this is the result of the resurrection, because the subjugation of woman was the result of the fall. So Eve has nothing to do with this in terms of saying that we cannot use Eve and what happened at the fall as an excuse for the subjugation of woman, because Christ has eliminated that by rising from the dead. Just as Adam was liberated, just as death was destroyed, women are equal to men in the church, period. Chrysostom just said that. I just read it to you. There's nothing about women that is inferior to a man. This doesn't mean that we have always the exact same roles. But for the most part, in the church, roles are determined by the charisma, by the grace, by the gift of the Holy Spirit, with the one exception of the priesthood and now the episcopacy. But I'm a teacher, I'm a chanter. We have women teachers and readers and chanters. As a matter of fact, in Greece, there's a 24-hour television and radio station called 4E, Tessera Epsilon, the numeral 4 and the letter E. And it's run by women. And there's a Sisterhood of St. Lydia. This is in northern Greece. They have religious programming. They have female theologians on there all the time talking. It's in the Greek language. They have services from their church in northern Greece in a town called Asprovalta. And the women are doing all the chanting. And there's nothing wrong with that. So this is the Orthodox way. It is to affirm the talents of women for whatever they can do in the church. The only thing that we cannot do is become priests, okay? But that is not an impediment in any way, because most men also will never be priests. Now, what about this clean and unclean business? So why do we never see women in the altar? This is a Jewish concept. The church does not have the concept of ritual cleanliness. We recognize that which is sacred and that which is profane, what is appropriate, what is inappropriate, what is reverent and not reverent, but there's no such thing as ritual cleanliness. Now, we don't see women in the sanctuary, right? Because we don't have deaconesses anymore in the church. We don't have female deacons. So we don't see women in the sanctuary, and we haven't had female deacons in the church for a very long time. And because of this, people would look at the women, only men would go in the altar area. And so they kind of said, well, why do only men and boys go into the altar? So they started saying, well, it's because women are unclean. And then I heard this growing up, of course. I also heard, well, women can go in the altar. They're unclean, so they can't go in the altar. They can't be altar boys or anything like this. But they can go in the altar to clean. And that is the most ridiculous thing. In other words, to sweep. to dust. I don't know. It's the most ridiculous thing. Because if she is unclean, then how can she go into the altar to clean it? It doesn't even make sense. Okay? So this is a very, very bad message. It is not that women cannot enter the altar of an Orthodox church, but any man can. That's a mistake. It's a very bad message. There is no such thing that as uncleanliness, as ritual uncleanliness in the church. We eliminated that a long time ago, at the time of the apostles. And when the woman with the issue of blood came to touch the Lord, or the sinful woman who wept at his feet, he didn't say, get away from me, you're unclean. He didn't recognize ritual uncleanliness. He touched dead people. He touched lepers. He let the sinful woman, he went into the houses of tax collectors and sinners. So the truth is that no one can enter the sanctuary, whether it's a man or a woman, unless they have the permission of the bishop. That is the rule. Not that any man can go in, but a woman cannot. That is the rule. It's Canon 69 of the 102 canons. That's the Council in Trullo, Benthecti. Okay? That's what it says. It doesn't say anything about women staying out. It says no one can enter unless they have a blessing of the bishop. How do you get blessed by the bishop? You're either ordained or you're tonsured. So women can be tonsured to perform functions in the holy altar, to enter into the holy altar. They can be tonsured and have the permission of the bishop to do this. I've seen it myself, not only in convents, but in places, in other churches. Our very first parish, there was a woman who was assisting during the divine liturgy. She would get the censer ready. She didn't come out for the processions, but she was assisting the priest in the altar during the divine liturgy in Sacramento, California. And then I also saw this in the metropolis, the Greek Orthodox metropolis of Toronto. There was a woman who also performed this function for the bishop, an unmarried woman, a youngish woman too. She was like probably in her 30s or 40s. So women can serve in the altar with the proper permission of the bishop, but we're not used to seeing it because men are ordained these days. We don't see women taking a position as a deaconess, okay? So this is why. So it's really a very, very bad message to say to girls they're unclean. And this also is bad for boys, because boys get this idea that somehow they're superior just because they have certain body parts or because of their physiology. This is not good for boys either. And it's very, very bad for girls, okay? So we're not accustomed to seeing women enter the altar, but there is no such thing as ritual cleanliness. Now, I have been tonsured. That means I have the permission to enter the altar area, okay? But I never do that. Or I have sometimes in the past when I needed something from there, a book or something of that nature. But I've never let the congregation see me do that because people would be scandalized. But it would be nice if we began to see women entering, the sanctuary. So during Holy Week, not this past year, of course, but in the past, all of the priest is talking to all the men, the male chanters in the sanctuary, and I'm standing outside and I can't hear what they're saying. He's giving them instructions and I can't hear what they're saying. And I really feel the humiliation of my gender. I'll tell you that. Okay. Now, what am I supposed to say? Well, I'm tonsured. I don't even know if all those men are tonsured. Maybe they shouldn't be in the sanctuary, but I don't say, well, I'm tonsured, therefore I'm going in. What am I supposed to do? Create a problem for the priest? So there is something that we do have to be careful about these things. And but I want you to know the truth. And the truth is that no one can enter the sanctuary without the permission of the bishop. And that means a tonsure or ordination. And women can do this, but it's up to the priest, because the priests, and I've got to tell you, there are Orthodox parishes where women do enter the sanctuary. They do enter the altar area. It's not a big deal. But that's kind of a rare thing because we're only beginning to learn the truth of our tradition. Okay? So what about the idea of the women's monthly cycle, and what about that? Where does that come from? So we do have a couple of canons that talk about the woman's monthly cycle. There, I looked it up. One is Dionysius of Alexandria. The other is Timothy of Alexandria. So what about this? Well, here again, when we look at why these canons were created, we have to look at the reasons, or also that a woman after giving birth to a child is not supposed to come to church for 40 days, right? When we look at these, we have to look at the reality of life at the time that these canons were written. Okay, so women were exempted. The fact is, we are supposed to be in church every single Sunday, period. There's no excuse unless we're sick. But a woman could be excused if she's having her cycle, because sometimes we have very bad cramps, or I've known some women to have headaches. But it's more than that. Sometimes women would leak, okay? And it was embarrassing. This is the truth. All of us today, all women, even in modern societies where we have products that help to avoid us staining our clothes, nonetheless, it has happened to all of us that we still got a stain. Now, what happens if you are living in a village, several hundred years ago? You're going to take the chance of coming to church and then getting a stain in your clothes because they didn't have what we have today, and we still get stains. Okay, I had it happen to me, and I was at church. I noticed. This is something else. But I could get in my car and drive home and change my clothes. What if you don't have a car? What if you don't have another change of clothes? You see, we're judging the church based on the circumstances which exist today in a modern world, especially if you're listening to me in English, in advanced countries where we have all kinds of things. But I remember seeing a program once about a program in India where they're teaching women how to make sanitary napkins to distribute them in the village because girls were not going to school when they were having their cycle. So several days out of the month, they couldn't go to school. That's not good. So this is a real problem, okay, that is faced by women, has been faced for generations. And the church, in its kindness, exempted women from going to church. Okay, that doesn't mean. And what do people and how do people interpret this? They read the Old Testament where it says they're unclean, therefore they can't come into the church. Somehow they're going to defile the church. This goes contrary to everything we know about Christ. And so that is not the reason. But there was a kind of physical uncleanliness or embarrassment that could result because of their particular situation. Now, I'm the wife of a priest, so I've had a lot of women ask me whether or not they should take communion during their cycle. This is a very personal thing. And, that we used to be very absolute. We were all taught, the girls were all taught, don't receive. Okay. Why? Because we're unclean. That's what we were taught. But in terms of, I will not tell you what to do. This is a conversation you have to have with your spiritual father. And priests differ on this. There are priests who will say, go ahead and receive, because they recognize that there's no such thing as clean or unclean in the church. However, other priests feel that it's better to abstain. So you, if you have this question, should talk to your spiritual father or your parish priest and ask him. Don't be ashamed to ask him about this. This is why I had so many women come to ask me the question. I would never answer the question for my husband, even though I knew his answer. I would never answer for a priest. That's his responsibility. So there's other types of uncleanliness that are far worse than this, and that is sin. For us in the church, the real uncleanliness is sin. So, but that doesn't mean that you should receive, especially if your conscience tells you not to. You should talk to your parish priest about it. Believe me, he's been asked about it. It's nothing to be ashamed of. It's a normal thing. He might feel that you should abstain in that case. Out of humility, don't receive. He might say, go ahead and receive. So then you know one way or the other. But don't be nervous about asking your parish priest about that. Okay? So at any rate, I think we've had a kind of wide-ranging discussion today. I hope it answered a lot of your questions. I hope you begin to realize that the church is reasonable. And the church is merciful. And the church really, and this is actually the practice of the early church. And Father Kosta mentioned how people were uneducated. This is true. I mean, we're just coming out of a very, very dark period of our history for the Greeks, and in particular, but other places in Egypt, in the Middle East, they're still under Islamic persecution and occupation. And it's been difficult for people to learn even basic letters, even how to read. And even if they could read, there were no books available. So sometimes things were repeated out of ignorance. But now that we have come to a point in the church when we have availability, when people can learn, when we have lots of information available to us, it's time for us to set aside those statements that were made out of ignorance and understand what the church was really trying to say by saying that if you're having your monthly period, you don't have to come to church. The church was not saying that you are unclean. Even if some bishops may have expressed it that way in the past, the church in its wisdom and the tradition of the church in the Bible is that nothing that God made is unclean, right? Remember the famous vision of St. Peter in the book of Acts? There was he saw a big piece of fabric that came down, and he was hungry because it was before lunchtime, and he was praying and before lunch, and he had this vision in which he saw all these unclean animals that came down lowered in front of him, and they said, Peter, kill and eat. And then he said, no, I will never touch anything unclean. That was the Jewish law, right? And this happened 3 times. And finally he said, nothing that I have made is unclean. So God, remember, made everything good. And that means everything is clean. The only thing that renders us unclean is sin. This is why the Lord said it's not what goes into our mouths and makes us unclean. It's what comes out. That's what is in our heart. This is what makes us unclean. And yet the church is very accommodating to the needs of people in society. So when women were unable to come to church because they might face embarrassment, because they didn't have a change of clothes, because there was a chance that they might have an accident in the church, this could happen, that they could start dripping. I mean, this is reality, dear people. I will tell you, that happened to me once at church. I was in the hall and I looked down at my foot and there was a spot of blood on my foot. I didn't even feel it. Good thing I looked down. That was very potentially embarrassing. What's that blood on your foot? Seriously. Okay? I'm saying this to you honestly, but all women have had this kind of experience. And that's with all the things that are available to us. At least I didn't have to, I wasn't living in a village and subject to kind of a humiliation or embarrassment of that. I just was able to clean it. Water is not always available in many places in the world for women to wash. What if they don't have another change of clothes? My grandmother had one dress. My father's mother, her name was Eugenia, too, had one dress. She wore it every single day. She probably had another one just for church. But on a daily basis, she wore the same dress every single day. She washed it out at night and hung it up to dry. That's what my father told me. That was the Great Depression in this country, okay? So this is how people live in most of the world. So before we start criticizing the church, let's learn what the church really teaches. Let's remember why these rules or why these guidelines were put into place in the first place, okay? And recognize that the church always has our best interests and our salvation at heart, okay? Well, that's it for today. I'm glad we were able to have Father Kosta join us. Made us our time a little bit livelier. Now, next week, we will go ahead and talk about Philemon, and probably won't spend the entire time on Philemon, but we will probably begin the book of Hebrews. So I hope you'll join us at that time. And now let's close with our prayer. Lord, now let your servants depart in peace according to your word. For our eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared before the face of all peoples, a light to enlighten the Gentiles, and the glory of thy people Israel. Christ is risen from the dead, trampling down death by death, and upon those in the tombs bestowing life. Alithos anesti, O Kyrios. Good night.